All right, I think I'm going to call this meeting to order. I am going to call this meeting to order. Think it. Westwood Media Center is videotaping. Is there anybody else who would like permission to videotape? No? Okay. So jumping right into the chair's report. First thing is I'm going to do these out of order. I'm going to do the membership update first. We would like to welcome Chris Coleman, our Westwood's new town administrator, to committee. Chris, do you want to just say a couple words about where you came from and how excited you are to be here?
Thank you very much. So previously I worked for the town of Needham as their assistant town manager. I was there for 14 years, had opportunity to see the good work that Don Whittier did, our last school project there. I'm very excited to be here. I'm excited about this project, and I just want to thank you for the warm welcome.
Great, thank you. Well, welcome. We're very excited to have you. And also, I just wanted to let you know, at the last school committee, Tony mentioned that we are going to be looking for another community member to join the committee. The school committee is potentially someone with, preferably someone with an architecture background or something along those lines, just to give us that level of expertise. So next session, we might have an update on that, but at this point, I just wanted to make everyone aware we may have someone new joining. In terms of project updates, so we had our second set of community sessions, forums. The first was on December 9th, second was on December 12th. Again, it was the same format. And this was really focused on educational programming. We spoke to Doran Whittier did a great presentation, particularly Jason did a great presentation, basically about what it's like to be a student now, how students learn, and how modern schools cater to that learning, and how traditional schools can be a challenge to that type of learning. I thought they both went well. They were, I would say, well attended, given it was a December rainy night. And I think the members of the public who came were very much engaged. I thought they thought it was really interesting. We had some great questions from the floor. We had some great breakout sessions. And so overall, I think they went really well. So I'd like to thank Doran Whittier for another great set of forums. I don't know if anyone has any questions about them.
Just note that Westwood Media Center did video that as well, so
Yes.
if someone wants to see that, if they missed it, it's online.
Yep,
on
they
our
videotaped the
website.
first one. All right, so moving on to discussion items. The first thing we're going to have is a presentation of so Doran Whittier has been conducting an existing conditions evaluation of the buildings and the sites. And so they are going to present on that to us, and also we're going to discuss in that space summaries. So I am turning it over. Oh, I forgot to say, Nancy Hyde is participating remotely. Are you there, Nancy?
I am. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm so sorry. And because Nancy's calling in whenever we take a vote, we will have to do a verbal vote individually. So just so you know. Okay, back to Doran Whittier.
Great. Thank you, Maya. Again, I'm Don Walter, principal with Doran Whittier. We have some members here who weren't at the last SBC meeting, so maybe I'll
Yes,
give them
please.
a quick chance to introduce themselves and their roles before we get into our presentation.
Sure. Rob Fitzgerald with Doran Whittier Architects, project manager.
Glenn Gallred, project architect with the office.
And I'm Jason Boone, the educational facility planner on the team.
Terrific. Thank you. Well, thanks for having us back again. This has been a very robust process to date, and we anticipate it's going to continue that way. We've had multiple meetings with the community, as you've noted, working group. We've done some school tours. We had a meeting with MSBA. So there's been a lot going on, as well as you can imagine, work within our office. Today, what we want to do is give you an update on the process, just review the schedule quickly again. Going to talk about existing conditions with Glenn and Rob, talk about space needs, educational programming, and where we're going with these buildings, space summary, and then the evaluation criteria Tim will talk about at the end of the presentation. So that being said, so here's where we are. We started in October, and we're here with the SBC meeting. So there's been a lot of work done in the last just over 2 months. So moving forward, what we see happening is that we're going to start, and we've done this, we've started to develop the options. So as you know, there are 3 schools that we're looking at: Hanlon, Deerfield, and Hanlon Sheehan. And within there are a number of renovation, addition renovation, and new options that will be investigated. So between now and March, we'll be developing many of those options. And in March, we'll narrow them down to a few of what will become more preferred. And that will take place up through the month of June, where we'll submit to MSBA what is a preferred option that the community would like to study and bring into schematic design, which will then take place through next spring, where we'd anticipate a vote by the community on the option with all the costs put in place. And then expecting favorable votes, we'll go into our detailed design, which will have us putting this out to bid and construction sometime in the spring of 2022, with an opening 2023 of the fall of 23 for the school year. So just a little more detail from, from November through March, you can see we've gone through all the facilities, us as architects and our consultants and engineers. So that's something we're going to talk about today, which are the existing conditions. Don't expect any surprises today. I think everyone has a good sense of the conditions of these facilities, but we'll let you know what we've seen. And we've gone through and we've been developing the educational plan, working with the community, and those options are now being developed, which leads us to the full range of options in March, which we pare down to the short list between March and June. We continue, and then, as I mentioned earlier, we will be selecting the final option that, upon approval of MSBA, will move into the schematic design through next spring. So that's a quick overview of the schedule. Any questions about that? If not, we'll just continue moving forward and start talking about the existing conditions. Glenn? It's you.
Good start. Generally, I don't suspect we're going to reveal a whole lot of new information about what you know about the existing buildings. They've served the community well. You guys have taken great care of them. This is evidenced by our detailed walkthroughs. And we are also reviewing previous studies to make sure we can catalog what was noted then and update what's been done since those have been done. I think starting with the Hanlon site, our landscape architect took a look at the existing conditions and how the building sits on the site and in the neighborhood. And this is the first step in looking at what we might see on that site moving forward.
Excuse me, just on that last picture,
Yeah.
there's all the green area up in the back.
Yes,
Is that town-owned property?
it is.
Okay, so that could potentially be used at some time.
That is part of our development of options. We'll be taking that land into consideration.
Yes. Good question, though. At the Hanlon building, among others, being built in the late 40s, early 50s, it shows all the typical characteristics of a building that's not been built to energy code standards, educational space needs standards, and so on. But our process starts with looking at, as architects, looking at the shell, the spaces, the condition of the systems. And our consultant teams took a deep dive as well: mechanical, electrical, plumbing, fire protection, accessibility, and so on. And I don't think we need to dwell on each picture in terrible detail, but it tells the story of making do with what you guys have, whether it's roofs leaking or facades needing repairs. But I think what was most telling, I think, in the buildings I saw, is that regardless of the condition of the space and how well it may or may not serve the program, the teachers and the kids make great do with what they've got. The program is being delivered regardless of the space. I think moving forward, that will happen much better with a building designed to meet those needs. But at Hanlon, again, numerous systems and features are deficient, right? There's no accessibility considerations. Must be a difficult school to get around despite the fact it's on one level if you're in a wheelchair or otherwise enfeebled. The mechanical systems, especially this space in Hanlon, was fascinating to essentially crawl under the stairwell to get to, where the electrical service comes in. The boiler room is typical for the era. I think, was it classroom 7? There was sort of a distinct damp odor that we noticed on the walkthrough, and it sounds like the superintendent got the message and found a steam leak or something to that effect. So that was-
Personally find it, but yes, got somebody else on that.
But right, but it's a good example of again, keeping up with these Band-Aids as needed. But they come in waves, and I'm sure it's becoming more and more difficult to keep up. Deerfield, similar.
Just a question on this before you.
Sure.
We get a list, and I'm just thinking about, as other people start talking to us and all, about a list of the deficiencies,
Yes.
like, the last time we did an architectural thing, we had code violations and all of that. It was a very powerful thing to see.
Yeah.
What they're putting up with. It was safe, but.
Right.
And the second thing is, as we look at all these different options, will we be able to see what the cost might be if, as a town, we have to do this on our own? Eventually,
Yeah.
what's the cost? You're going to have to do it sooner or later with state help or without it, but, will that be built in as far as, this is what it's going to look like if you do this on your own, and we'll have that also?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so we will absolutely have written reports on each facility, and it'll break down from site to architectural to structural to mechanical, electrical, plumbing. Everything will be included in that report. And in terms of the, what if the building were to stay, what needs to take place within that building? And we have an option, actually, that we're required to do through this MSBA process, which is, essentially a repair-only option. And you'll know what those costs would be to try to maintain the building or upgrade the building to continue to be viable.
Thank you.
But with that option, we will not be addressing space or educational issues.
But no, it's a good point. We need to check that box off through the process on all the buildings, the ones that may get touched and the ones that may not. And Deerfield, similar era, similar vintage, a little different plan and layout, but a lot of the same issues with the exterior envelope being thermally inefficient, in need of some repairs and updates. Interesting to see the entire roof was replaced. That must have been a substantial project just a couple of years ago. Again, showing that the town's interested in keeping the building stock usable and functional. Certainly some space needs. I was fascinated here especially to see what the media center folks, the library has been made to fit in a former classroom, so it's, I don't know, a sixth or an eighth of the size that the kids and the staff should have. But again, making it happen. I think another picture here shows the cafeteria floors are in fantastic shape. For the age, they look great. So again, the town's doing a nice job taking care of things. Accessibility issues, mechanical systems, fixtures, furniture, and so on in the classrooms, all ready for replacement. And again, fascinating turn of the century, previous century engineering and technology in a lot of the systems. Then Rob will talk a little bit about Sheehan, a whole other dimension.
Yeah, so each of, for these two sites are, as Glenn had mentioned, we are taking a look at, what are the existing parameters and constraints from each of the sites. So this is a start, looking at, oops, I'm sorry. One more. Looking at the setbacks and existing building constraints and buffers and so forth. So this kind of sets the stage for our analysis of each of the sites as we start to consider, where could an addition or where could a new building go on this site. Looking at the exterior, as Glenn mentioned, we found the similarities between each of the buildings in that the vast majority of both the exterior and the interior are original, from original construction. Windows, and you see all of the glass block and so forth. Patching and repairs of the roof, it's just a matter of the time that's gone by in terms of, they've reached the end of and surpassed the end of their service life. One of the interesting things at the Sheehan School is they have a concrete waffle slab structural system, so this extends. So this is a load-bearing wall on the outside here and a load-bearing wall on the inside, so that makes it pretty difficult to do any significant structural changes. You can't fit or cut through that other than the size of that opening there in that waffle. And so it makes it much more challenging when we think about doing renovations. Here you can see, oops, I'm sorry, Jason, I got in the forehead. As you can see here in the attic space, this is residential style insulation, fiberglass bat insulation. It's also located directly above the ceiling. So in terms of thermal performance, it's really not that great. And as with each of the buildings done in the 40s and 50s, you can imagine there's very little insulation in the exterior walls, or if any. Accessibility is probably the most significant challenge at the Sheehan School. I mean, you can't even get into the building. There's no elevator, as you know, multiple floors. The wall thicknesses create significant challenges for handicap accessibility in terms of access into and out of spaces. There's some means of egress issues with door swings and exit signs and so forth. These guardrails, they don't meet today's standards for guardrail requirements or specifications. So it's not a fault of anyone other than they've reached the end of their life. Similar story with the mechanical, electrical, plumbing systems. They're trying to make do with the spaces that they have. We saw some creative work here to try to bring air or into a space or exhaust out of a space. People kind of making do with the things that they have. In the report, which was just uploaded into a Dropbox yesterday, so there's about 350 pages of bedtime reading for you guys. But included in that is also an initial pass at looking at traffic impacts. So this is just one example that we're going to show here that's highlighted in the report. So when this particular option here looks at a combination of Hanlon and Deerfield together on the Hanlon site, and so what types of impacts does that have? So just as a big picture, Deerfield is very kind of a rural community, so this traffic that would normally come down to the into the Deerfield School, people would generally go down on Fox Hill Street and in order to get to the Hanlon site. So there's less traffic around this intersection and a little bit more traffic around this intersection. That's really the big picture view. The majority of students currently either ride a bus or are dropped off or picked up by their parents in the Deerfield community. And so in terms of the ridership habits, really wouldn't change. It'd add a little bit more time, a few minutes to their on their morning or afternoon commute. Then we also looked at the space needs, and this is sort of a transition to some of Jason's work, but educationally, again, we found that the schools are making do with the spaces that they have. You can see out in the hallway here, they have tables and chairs set up, so students are being brought out there to provide some remedial assistance and extra help, and that's the space that they have to work in. The library, very constrained. Spaces that were designed as classroom spaces are needing for smaller groups, so they've kind of created barriers and temporary partitions in order to make that work. This early childhood office is in the basement level of the Hanlon School, which is really not a very ideal space for them, but again, they're making do. At Deerfield, similar type thing. This is the art space directly off of the gym. I don't think it was originally designed as an art space. This is a math coach area, which is directly off of the cafeteria, so you have to go through the cafeteria in order to get into that space. And again, pull-out spaces in the hallway. And then at the Sheehan School, they are making do with every single nook and cranny in that building. These are, a lot of these are previously storage rooms that they've located special needs instruction or remedial assistance, creative use of transfer air, in order, these slats above what used to be a glass, in order to get some sort of airflow into that space. And then music on the stage. So with that, I'll pass it on to Jason.
Thanks, Rob. We have a couple of objectives with this part of the presentation. I think the most important one is to actually have a discussion with you about what is being proposed as spaces in the three different scenarios themselves. Keeping in mind, Rob and Glenn's observations that one of the biggest differences between education in the 1950s and education in the 21st century is there's far more adults involved in the educational process now. The programs and services that are being delivered are far more robust than they were when those buildings were built. Things like special education didn't even exist, weren't on people's minds when those buildings were built. And then the type of spaces that are required, there's far more variety necessary to deliver education today than there was back then. So what we're proposing in terms of spaces reflects all of those observations. So I'll first remind you what Don had said, that there are three different scenarios. And from the MSBA's process point of view, that means we have to produce three different sets of documents for each one of these scenarios. We have to produce a space summary document for each agreed upon enrollment and an educational program narrative for each one of these agreed upon enrollments. And so today we're going to focus on the space summary portion of that. In order to define that document, Don mentioned we've hosted a number of meetings. We've walked through the buildings and observed spaces educationally ourselves. We've met with the principals. We had 3 hours with faculty and staff across the entire district as part of a professional development visioning workshop. We've had the principal's assistance in developing these space summary documents. We've had 2 of those meetings. Don mentioned the school tours, and then May at the start of the meeting mentioned all of our public visioning sessions where we've had input from the community as well. All of this information gathering has informed what we're going to share with you in terms of the space summary. Just to give you a flavor of what the faculty and staff visioning was like, we had them speculate about what types of spaces and features needed to happen in the building. So we had them do a little bit of modeling, created these 11 by 17 visioning boards. What you're seeing here is a desire for more places for students to carve out their own kind of environment. What's being depicted here is window reading seats, sort of a window ledge where people can climb up in there and have individual time. And they also speculated about groups of spaces necessary to deliver the educational program. So what you're seeing here on the left is a set of a pair of classroom diagrams, and on the right, a whole grade level of classrooms. And again, all of this information is informing what we're doing in terms of the space summary. So here are some of the basics coming out of those meetings. And we'll talk more about the first 3 bullets in just a moment. But for the Hanlon only scenario, what's being proposed right now based on our observations is 3 sections per grade level. For the Hanlon Deerfield combination, 5 sections per grade level, and the Hanlon Sheehan 6 sections per grade level. The second 2 in particular are more sections per grade in a single building than anything that you have at the elementary level currently. So everybody just needs to be aware of, two of these three scenarios are larger schools, more students under one roof than anything you have currently. We've had a lot of discussion around the special education programs, and what's been communicated is the current programs that you have will remain, but they may shift location depending on the scenario, and those conversations are ongoing. And then finally, two sort of global planning principles. One, to try to organize grade levels into geographic clusters. In other words, all the kindergartens are together instead of one kindergarten being over here and one being on the other side of the building, as a geographic practice. And then second, to recognize that the public are going to use these buildings, and there's a lot of logic in zoning the building into places that can be closed off in an after-hours or evening community event, and places that you want to make available to the public all the time. And then drilling down into a little more detail, coming out of that faculty visioning day, we have a number of things we're trying to achieve as we start to get into the options development process. Things like recognizing that instead of having small group instruction happening out in the hallway, to design intentional space for that function between pairs of grade level classrooms. That classrooms themselves shouldn't be designed to support just a sort of a stand and deliver instructional practice, but instead be zoned into multiple activities so that differentiated instruction can occur simultaneously. Flexibility is paramount at all levels, not just at the move the furniture around level, but how can the building evolve over time? This project is going to outlast all of us, so it needs to be able to adapt over time and be flexible enough to do that. We already talked about the variety of space. One of the things I think the architecture team is most excited about is this next bullet, this recognition that all children at all ages need to move, and that that's not necessarily a bad thing. But here, what we've heard from faculty and staff and our working group is to sort of take that one step further and recognize that elementary children need this sense of wonder, the sense of exploration. So maybe there's a sort of a museum, children's museum-like experience for students where we're allowing them to engage with the architecture in a way that your 1950s buildings never recognized. We've already talked about special education, and then another one that came up over and over and over again was to take advantage of the outdoor features that are present as part of the learning experience. On the Hanlon site, for example, we have all the woodlands that we could use as a way of documenting foliage or observing natural fauna, insects, anything outside. So we're trying to think about that as we position these options on the site to take advantage of the outdoors. So how we're going to proceed, we've focused our attention on the scenario that's in the middle. Time is always limited, so what we've done is we focused all of our principal workshops and our time at the working group at the Hanlon Deerfield consolidation scenario, knowing that we can ratchet that down for the Hanlon only and ratchet it up for the Hanlon Sheehan scenarios, knowing that there's going to be some nuanced changes between them, things like numbers of classrooms, the size of the cafeteria will change, but the underlying principles will apply to all three. So this is what's being proposed at the moment, and I'll walk us through these, because the MSBA has a set of guidelines. We don't necessarily have to follow all of the guidelines, but there are consequences occasionally when we don't follow the guidelines. So for example, in the core academic area, I mentioned that for this combination, we're proposing 5 sections per grade level. On the next slide, I'll get into that a little bit in a little bit more detail, but that's the major delta between what we're proposing at 39,000 square feet and what the MSBA recommends for this population at 25,000 square feet. Special education, again, 10,000 square feet, largely related to the programs and services that are being provided. Art and music, we're right in line with what the MSBA expects. Health and PE, it's been suggested that the community may be interested in a slightly larger gymnasium, and again, we'll come back to this in just a minute, than what the MSBA suggests is appropriate for an elementary school. And then all of the rest of the categories, media center, dining and food service, medical, administration and guidance is actually a little low, and again, I'll talk about that in just a moment. Custodial maintenance, we're all right in the ballpark. So really all we're talking about in terms of deviations from the MSBA guidelines for this scenario are at the core academic level, special education, and the gymnasium. And so if we were to drill down into that a little bit further, like I mentioned, in the core academic, what we're proposing is 5 sections per grade level instead of what the MSBA says is appropriate 20 sections for grades 1 through 5, or 4 sections per grade level for grades 1 through 5. So we're proposing 5 extra classrooms in the core academic area over and above what the MSBA thinks might be appropriate for this population. You observed in Rob's presentation the idea of places outside the classroom for students to use for instruction. Right now, those are unintentionally designed just places in the corridor. Extended learning areas would be intentional places for things like movement activities to happen, science experiments, large-scale science experiments to happen, grade level activities to happen. So that's another deviation from the MSBA guidelines. Student support services, this is an overage because the MSBA doesn't have guidelines for these spaces, but they recognize that they're necessary and they would be eligible for reimbursement. And then finally, I mentioned a minute ago that the admin category was a little bit under the MSBA guidelines. It's because we've moved some of those spaces to this category to recognize that geographically they want to go where the classrooms are, not where the main office is. So of this overage, largely the extra classrooms and part of the extended learning spaces may be ineligible for reimbursement. So you see that 9,200 net square feet may be ineligible. You never quite know until you put something in front of the MSBA what their disposition is going to be, so we don't want to suggest that we know exactly what the outcome of that request might be. So before I get to special education, maybe we pause there and have a quick discussion about the numbers of classrooms and respond to any questions you have about why we might be doing that or what the advantages of that might be.
I think it might be helpful just to talk about class size guidelines here
Sure.
and how we arrived at that.
Sure.
that number.
So the MSBA has assumptions about class size, and the district has recommendations for class size also, and they don't always line up. So for example, the MSBA bases their kindergarten classroom count on 18 students per classroom. They base their grades 1 through 5 classroom count on 23 students per classroom. The district's guidelines are lower than that. And so in all of our discussions, what we felt was appropriate was to determine the number of classrooms based on 18 across the board.
If I could just clarify for people who may not have our guidelines memorized, the class size guidelines in Westwood are 18 to 22 for K to 3 and 18 to 24 for 4 and 5. So using 23 for K to 3 puts us slightly above our internal guidelines.
Right. And even if that were tolerable, it puts you sort of right at the upper limit when you reach the agreed upon enrollment of class size with almost no room for any sort of growth or flexibility. So the additional 5 classrooms are about keeping the class size low on opening day and staying within the district's class size guideline once you reach that agreed upon enrollment a few years into the building's life cycle. Yeah, Charlie?
Under the core academic, are elementary schools today coming up with additional rooms for science or for computer? They're not in the traditional, so many per class, just other places within the building that would be like a space that kids go to move, but also to, or is that's not a concept that's at the elementary level yet?
So let me see if I can respond to that this way. In Massachusetts, and I think this is a characteristic nationwide, well-designed elementary schools are embodying more spaces than just classroom for instruction. What I mean by that is things like small group rooms, recognizing pull-out services by a student support person or a special educator. Things like extended learning spaces for movement activities right at the classroom area is universally adopted for elementary schools. In relation to science, what's not up on the screen but what's cooked into the proposal for this scenario is what the MSBA calls a STEM space. That's a science, technology, engineering, math space, and it's over and above the classroom count. So that would be, similar in nature to an art room or a music room or, something like that, where it's an exploratory, a special that the district may choose to offer. And the MSBA allows those now, given certain conditions, and would be eligible for reimbursement under those conditions.
So one thing I think is interesting, Charlie, is that, we're developing the educational program. It is the document that we submit to MSBA, which then really sort of drives this design. And something that's unique about Westwood's program right now is that we do offer coding as a special. And so, it's very easy to say to the MSBA, this is part of our program, it's part of what we do, and so we would need space to support
Right.
what already exists here in Westwood.
And one thing I want to clarify, this group, the school building committee, I think today is going to be making sort of these decisions on, do we go with the MSBA recommendation of 20 classes? Do we go with what, is proposed up here for 25 classes? And we're going to be doing that for the core academic. We're going to talk about special education. We're also going to talk about health and PE. So this is really the group today and now that are going to be sort of deciding how we're directing the architects to go forward. I think given that, if we're talking about core academic, what might be helpful is to run through the math. And just, I know we talked about how we got to 25 just with the guidelines, but if you could break it down a little bit more for people, and also maybe potentially give us a little bit about cost idea. One thing that we talked about doing is saying to the MSBA, this is what we would like, and then, if the MSBA comes back and says, well, we're not going to include this, or this will be ineligible, we can then have another discussion about how much we actually want to move forward, how much we want to take on. But I think giving a little more context as to how we got to 25 instead of 20, and also maybe a little bit of the cost, how much will 5 extra classrooms approximately cost if they're not reimbursable? And remember, even if they're reimbursable, it's still just that percentage that we're going to get back. They're not fully reimbursable. So I think that kind of information might be helpful for this discussion right now.
Sure, so let me start with the math side. The arithmetic is relatively easy. If you take the agreed upon enrollment, which for this group is 560 students, and divide it by 6, assuming it's evenly distributed among the grade levels, that gives you a certain number of students per grade. I don't have that number memorized in my head. But if you take that number then and divide it by 18, it yields 5 and a small fraction. And so that's how we end up with 5 sections per grade level, is by doing that basic arithmetic. Take the total enrollment divided by 6, take the grade level enrollment and divide it by 18, and that's how many sort of core academic general classrooms we would have in the project. On the cost side, I'm going to let somebody else handle that question. But I think what's most important for the design team is to know how we should proceed to this first submission, knowing that we can change our mind. Actually, for the next 2 submissions, it's when we submit the schematic design that everything has to be fully cooked and a done deal. So if, for example, this school building committee directs the design team to assume 5 sections per grade level for this enrollment scenario, waiting to see what the MSBA says about potential eligibility when we make this first submission, that would be useful information for us to have. So I don't know if Tim or Don, you guys want to comment on the.
Well, so, just doing it quickly, if you take that 9,200 of ineligible space and you multiply it by the grossing factor of 1.5, which, classrooms might have a little less, and then you take $600, which is roughly what we're budgeting a square foot, and you multiply it by that, again, by roughly 25% for soft costs, it comes to $10 million.
So that's the estimated cost?
Yes, I just wanted to make sure I understood your math. So when you take that 93 and divide it by 18, you get 5.18. That's the
Yeah.
classrooms?
Did you
So I
guys?
just want to point out, when you divide it by 20, you get 4.66. You can't build a .66 classroom. So you're still really talking about 5 classrooms, regardless whether it's 18 or 20. I just want to make sure I understand the math and the logic, right? Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So if we're just talking about the classrooms themselves, at 900 square feet times the 1.5 grossing factor, you're just under about $1 million a classroom.
So 5 extra classrooms,
It's less than $5 million.
right.
So what's the 10? What was the 10 million?
When I was looking at all the 9,200 that's up there on the slide.
That, all of the thing that's ineligible.
It may have, it had just about the 5 classrooms.
So you're talking about 5 million for 5 classes that may be,
Just under, yeah.
So
Yeah,
would-
we're speaking in, right, we're doing math live in the room, that's
no one is holding you to these numbers.
Right.
So should the MSBA deem these extra classrooms ineligible for reimbursement, that's sort of the order of magnitude that we're talking about, around $1 million a classroom.
Yeah.
And I don't know, Tim, would you be looking for counsel from the building committee today about whether the design team should be proceeding with this 5 classroom assumption, or?
Well, I thought Maya framed it very well. I mean, assuming people want to move ahead the way, what Westwood is looking at, and it's always a good idea to try to maximize, just what we can do to justify maximizing reimbursement, because it's in the long term better. I think if we just get a general idea that you're okay with proceeding like that, we're going to have to come back to you once the MSBA looks at this and say, of the 9,200, they gave us 4,000, or they, whatever. And I think so. It would be good just to say, you're okay with us moving ahead with it, but I don't think anyone should think that this is the final decision on what you're going to be paying or what the MSBA will do. So that, I think that would be helpful. I mean, if somebody said, we don't want to move anything that they're going to be ineligible, then that would be good direction to have. But if you're willing to let us sort of work with the process, I think, normally these work that you put something in front of them and I call it a negotiation, but it's not really. It's more of a discussion with them and trying to justify things.
I think it's important to note that MSBA absolutely takes into consideration a district's policy.
Yeah, they do, right.
Yeah.
It's not like you're making this up.
I just want to follow up with what Emily said. I think what you could advise us on that would be helpful is we're now doing coding in the 3rd grade, okay? And you mentioned how the MSBA is interested in STEM education. Where is that going? Where are the advanced towns? Because our middle schools now are doing engineering and computer science, and, preparing the kids to move into that. So what innovative things could be taught in a STEM room or something like that?
Yeah, good question.
Would be helpful to you educate us a little bit more about, because right now, we're being pushed, but there may be somebody else that's been doing this a few years
Sure.
longer, and how have they accommodated that education?
So, unless I'm mistaken, the fact that the project right now has a STEM space, I don't know is being questioned. It's not in these extra classrooms that we're proposing that the MSBA may not participate in. The STEM room, the MSBA would participate in. But in terms of what that space provides you in terms of instructional flexibility, now you can incorporate, making and design thinking and coding, digital research in a much more hands-on way than you couldn't without a space. In fact, you're doing a lot of this in your elementary schools and existing spaces already. It's just now you would have a purpose-built space to host those kinds of programs. Yes.
I think what I'm interpreting is all these different spaces, they're tied to our educational plan. And
Yes.
we're not just kind of making that up.
Oh,
as it sounds
absolutely,
like.
yes.
Yeah.
But that might be one of the things that we keep reiterating, because this is all tied to that education
Yep.
plan. And it's not just, this is really nice to have in Westwood. No, this is just how we do education in Westwood.
Right.
So that way.
The other thing I'm interested in as we go through this is going to be a school that's not a part of this, and all this innovative stuff. So any creative idea for small money that an additional STEM place could be put into another school, just so they're not being left behind,
Sure.
They got this place. Could we add to the schools, our school that isn't a part of this, innovative things for low money that we could afford to begin to say we're not forgetting them?
Yeah, and I think we've heard that over and over again. What about whatever schools might not be impacted by the project? And I think what we've tried to communicate is that we're looking at ways that those projects could be impacted, and what the appetite in the town is for actually doing something at whatever the project doesn't touch, but outside the MSBA process. And all of those discussions continue to be ongoing. So any final discussion about the 5 classrooms in the core academic area? Is there general consensus that the design team should proceed with that assumption and see what the MSBA's feedback is, and then we may alter course in what's called the PSR phase. I see a lot of heads going up and down. Is that a fair?
Yeah,
fair
does
assumption? Okay.
anybody disagree with this proposal, that we move forward with the 25 classrooms? Everyone's in agreement? Okay?
Terrific.
Right.
So at the special education level, it's a slightly different set of circumstances because the MSBA has guidelines for individual spaces, but at the end of the day, they defer to the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education based on what the district is providing in terms of services and programs. So this delta that you see, this a little more than 4,000 square feet delta in the special education category is directly linked to the nature of the programs that you're offering. And there are certain regulations about size and numbers of students and whether there's a private toilet or not a private toilet. And so we're simply providing the space necessary to serve the programs in that category. And based on everything we know, there isn't any reason why the full delta there would be eligible for MSBA reimbursement. So there's not really anything to discuss there in terms of eligibility because we're assuming the MSBA is going to fully participate in all of those. So the last thing we want to talk about is in the health and PE category, this idea of a slightly oversized gymnasium. So in many communities, there's a desire to have, something that can be a resource to the community to make it slightly more functional for educational reasons during the school day. And so what the MSBA has is their guideline for elementary gymnasiums is a 6,000 square foot gym, 60 by 100. And what that gets you is enough room to have one competition regulation high school basketball court with a little bit of runoff, but no bleachers. Or sort of an elementary sized, slightly smaller than regulation basketball court with the appropriate runoff and a few rows of bleachers. And so what we've talked about and what's led to this proposal is the idea of having the high school competition court, the appropriate runoff, and a couple of rows of bleachers. And so that's how we get this extra 2,000 square feet, knowing that the MSBA does have a strict policy about oversized gymnasiums and that we know that square footage will be ineligible for reimbursement. So again, if there are any questions or discussion about that, we'd be interested in having the same sort of direction from this group.
So I do want to point out, there is also a third option, just to muddy the waters a little bit. We could go even higher, around 10,000 square feet, and maybe you can explain it better than I can.
Sure. So I would draw a picture, but I don't know if anyone will be able to see it if I draw it over there.
I think if you use that one.
All right, well, I'll give it a go.
I'm in the path of.
Live in the room is challenging. Drawing live on camera is also challenging.
Maybe you could start with the 6,000 and then add on.
Sure. So the standard MSBA elementary gymnasium, like I said, I'm feeling a lot of pressure.
Doing great.
Is 6,000 square feet. And what you get for that
Not
Very
bad.
impressive,
Wow.
Jason.
That's all kind of lies.
It's better than I would do it.
is that. Right, with 5 or 6 feet of runoff, regulation court going the long direction, but no bleachers. What's being proposed is something that's a little wider, has the same court, but now has enough room for 3 or 4 or 5 rows of bleachers on one side, right? What this doesn't do, and I wish I had a different color, is it okay if I?
Oh, we got some over on the other. There's lots of color.
When the bleachers are in the closed position, what's different between this and Maya's 10,000 square foot option is that the cross courts would not be full length. They would only be, 70 to 74 feet.
I'm just going to take a picture for Nancy, who's on the.
Sorry, Nancy.
Yep.
Thanks, man.
And then what Maya was describing was if we go one step further and we have all the same features, we have the bleachers, now we can get essentially 3 full-size high school courts in 10,000 square feet, where even in the cross direction, we have the full 84-foot length competition court. So, what's the dimensions of that third one? So, this court is 84 feet, 50 feet. Similarly, for those, all 3 of them are the same size.
The box.
Oh, I'm sorry, the box. 100 by 100.
Jason.
Maximum of 2 courts being used at the same time.
Jason,
Correct.
Or actually, yeah, maximum 2.
Yes.
minor correction. When you do the 2 court over 100, it's not quite regulation size. Because if you want the full regulation double, that's a 120 by 100.
This is this guy?
No, if you want when you do the 100 by 100, the cross court is a little bit smaller than the regulation size.
Thinner.
Oh,
You need to go.
I'm sorry, I'm sorry, you're right. We would need to make this just slightly over 10,000 square feet.
It has to
have
be
them-
12,000
Yes.
square feet if you.
So thank you
want
for that.
full size.
Does everybody understand what he's saying? So this is 50, and this is 50, so we need some extra feet in the length. So it would be slightly larger than 10,000 square feet.
It's basically double of the 60 by 100 if you want 2 full-size courts. We're slightly short.
So
Are you proposing slightly short, or you're saying that his numbers are wrong?
You, for the, there's no, for elementary school, it's really up to the community's choice. There's no wrong answer. There's nothing wrong. It's just that the clarification is that at 100 by 100, the cross court is a little bit narrow than the high school size court.
Right, it would be a middle school size
Right.
court. So it's
that.
not, so the
Right.
2 additional courts running cross court still won't be high school, they'll be middle school.
But you can use them for Metro West middle school games.
I don't know, does anyone know? I don't know.
That would be
If it-
good to know, because if you can't use them for a Metro West middle school game, that limits the usage of those courts.
Yeah.
My understanding is the regulation middle school is 74 feet long.
Yes.
But what's the width?
It's still 50 feet.
It's 50.
Okay, so
The
then.
width is always the same.
Yeah.
So I.
So I think the answer is yes.
It sounds like it, but we should probably do
Yes.
that, because that's our
Confirm that.
customer.
Right.
Yeah, and what we would need to know in terms of direction is no bleachers, some bleachers, prioritize 3 regulation courts.
And so for the some bleachers, option B, those 2 courts are not middle school.
These are, yes.
Oh, they are, but there wouldn't be bleachers if we had them.
We'd have to close the
If we
bleachers.
used them,
Right,
we'd have
so
to
they would
close
be-
the bleachers.
Exactly, right.
Yeah.
Because of the width.
Right.
Well, again, we would adjust this
Thurston is middle school.
to, to be in
Either
the 8,000
115?
square foot range.
You need bleachers, you gotta have people sit somewhere. But I think it,
40 people.
Yeah.
Do we have costs on these changes?
We will talk about that in a second.
Typical.
I mean, the concern here too is, we're spending time on this.
Basketball is,
I understand that, you want to get
grandparents,
the most bang
it's
for
about
your
40
buck,
people
but
that show up at the
you start
most
adding,
for
keep
youth.
adding things to this project, it's like a home project.
And that's exactly why we're having this discussion, because that's what the job of this committee is.
Right.
To decide, what do we add, what do we not add, what direction are we gonna give the, Now, the first discussion we had, we can pull back on that. We can say, we wanna go for 25, they're not, 5 of them aren't gonna be reimbursable, all right, let's do 20. This one, I think, is a little bit more difficult to pull back on, if I'm right.
It would be the same. We can change our mind on this too, all the way up until we submit the schematic design.
Okay.
So
Just this one, just to be clear, though, whereas that's subject to some back and forth with the MSBA, the
This is
top
not.
one, this is not.
Correct.
Right. So
All of this is
the
ineligible.
6,000 is eligible for reimbursement. Anything above that, we know will not be eligible for reimbursement.
We do know there's such a demand for
Right.
gym space in town. It's such an important part of the community. And we do, this, I think, some of these other options open this up to be more of a community building than just strictly elementary school building, which we've seen with other buildings, really helps. Helps to have that extra space for the whole community to come and utilize that space.
So can we get rough, not holding you to it, costs?
I mean, again, using the math that we've been talking about, if you take the $600 times the soft costs related at 1.25, you're talking about $800 a square foot times, what is it?
5,200 square feet delta for the biggest one.
Yeah, so what's that come to?
5,200?
Times
So
8,000.
that's 4 million.
4 million.
one.
For the biggest
Biggest
one,
option.
it would be an
I mean,
additional
this
$4
kind of
million.
construction, this is a really theoretical because a gym is probably less than $600 a square foot, but that's the number we're using for budgeting for the whole school.
Do you get reimbursed for, let's say you go with the biggest option, will you be reimbursed for it if you would use the smaller option?
Would you
Yes,
get-
in other
reimburse
words,
us $6,000?
they will reimburse you up to their guideline, but anything over that will be ineligible.
And what did you say the delta was between the smallest and the largest?
Roughly 4,000 square feet.
So around $4 million, right?
Is that right?
Is that what you
I didn't do the
You said
math.
800?
That seems,
I mean, that's probably high because again, 600 is what we're using for the whole school, but gym would be less expensive per square
Somewhere in the
foot. but
5 range.
I think
5
if,
million plus
Well, so-
well, no, I think you probably could
Wait
use a
minute,
little
wait
less.
I
so
think
maybe
we're
So
all
on-
talking at different numbers here.
Interestingly enough, when the MSBA calculates its reimbursement rate, they don't differentiate between what a gym really costs and what a classroom really costs.
Right.
Right.
They're going to take the whole project cost and deduct the gym square footage times the full project cost.
Right.
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 Regardless of whether it's really cheaper to build that kind of space versus a different kind of space, they're not going to differentiate. So in real dollars, it's the same as every other space in the project.
So really, it's 4,000, it's $4 million. It's $3.5 to $4
To go with
million.
it's $4 million
To go with that.
additional cost to the project that will not be reimbursed.
Not reimbursed,
Okay,
right?
so, and that's for the
Plus or
biggest
minus.
option. For the middle option, it's roughly 2 million, I'm guessing.
Yeah, because that's about halfway through, right?
So, and again, we can revisit this. In fact, perhaps this is an issue we could, bring up at one of the community forums after the new year. We just want some direction because square feet gobble up site. And, as we even develop these early options to know where we should be exploring, until we have more input would be helpful.
The one thing I would also add that we heard on 2 of the site visits, and I didn't go to the third, so maybe you even heard it there, was those districts really push the notion that they want a solid, for teaching, not for athletics, that they want a solid barrier between, to split the teaching stations.
you mean a curtain?
Curtain, but not a curtain.
But not a curtain.
Like
So,
It's closer
Yeah.
to
Right.
this.
It's closer to this, right?
right, so when we went
Which
to.
is very expensive when you're talking about that kind of height and.
So when we went to Needham, so we toured the Sunita Williams Elementary School in Needham, we toured a school in Millis, and we toured a school in Milford, which was a 3 to 5 school. The Millis one was K to 5. And in all of them, they had a gym, they had I think either some version of either 6,000 or the 8,000 gym. I think Milford had the 8 because they had the built-in bleachers. The other 2 had the 6 without the bleachers. In all 3 of them, they had a curtain partition that you could bring down to cut the room in half so you could have 2 gym classes going on at the same time. Particularly in Needham, we heard that it was almost impossible to conduct 2 separate classes at the same time because the curtain was effectively just a visual barrier, not an audio barrier, and it got just too loud in the gym. So another thing we might want to think about with the gym is whether to put one of these, real kind of partitions in there. Given the size of the school, it is likely that we would have two gym classes going on at the same time. But again, as Tim said, this is expensive, right?
So that, yeah, and the only reason why I'm offering it is that if you're going to decide to spend more space, realize that there is going to
Right.
be a desire to at least investigate putting a well over six-figure kind of petition through the
Right.
middle of it.
Do they make a curtain that's sound dampening?
I don't think they do, because, no.
You need a wall to be
Yeah.
effective.
And you have to store the wall, which, I mean, you see how
Right,
much
you create a
that
po-
small
you
is
have to
taking.
create a pocket for it.
And it needs so much, to be able to work right, it needs so much structural reinforcement and
You
to your
would
concern,
most
I know.
likely to do that as a motorized.
Yeah.
Because it's so.
And I would invite this group today to not get stuck on the wall or the
Wall.
curtain, right? What's important right now is
the
how big a
size of the
space
gym.
are we planning for, knowing that we can change our mind in the next step if we need to.
Well, I have a question for you.
Yes,
Have you been to the middle school?
I have been in the middle school.
All right, so everybody here is familiar with that. That looks more option, it's a little bit small as far as a regulation basketball court.
Yep, the middle
But
school is.
It's closer to the 8,000, and that has a curtain that comes down in the middle.
Yeah, all three of these could be divided into two teaching stations, essentially.
We would definitely have some partition. The question is whether to have a curtain or a wall, but again, that's not something we need to decide now.
Right.
I think the discussion is, do we want to do a gym, a regulation-sized gym with no bleachers at the 6,000, and we know that's all reimbursable, well, whatever percentage of it is reimbursable. Do we want built-in bleachers, gives us the flexibility to have two, will those be middle school size courts?
The cross courts could be middle school length,
Okay.
yes.
To do the second option, now, if we have the two middle school style courts, we're not going to have bleachers, so that might limit tournaments, but it certainly wouldn't limit practice or games. Or the final option, which is you get it all. And that's something that we should decide right now, and that's why we extended this meeting to an hour and a half.
Are there bleachers in that third option as well?
Yes.
Yes.
And the
Yeah.
bleachers, you can sit on the bleachers even if the two cross courts are being used.
Oh, awesome.
That's the difference between the second.
No.
We'd have to,
Oh, you can't?
we'd have to play with the configuration.
Then what's the advantage to the third over the second?
The advantage to the third is that the cross courts are high school regulation length
Oh,
also.
high school, sorry.
So
I
if, for
misunderstood.
example, you hybrided the middle one and the third one, and you had middle school cross courts, then yes, you potentially could have a few rows of bleachers pulled out and still have the middle school court.
Okay, that's what I thought that was doing,
But-
okay.
I think perhaps the way to think about, let's ignore the square footage for a few minutes. Define it as that we want this many courts,
Yeah.
and bleachers or not, and define the highest number. Like if you want two middle school court plus bleachers, that's the definition, and then they go back and then
Tell you how big
draw it
that is.
out, whatever the size would be.
Right.
And then that's not, it will be plus minus.
Yeah.
Yes, right, at this
All right.
point.
That would be the better way to define it for them.
Okay. So what do people think?
I think it'd be valuable also to, I don't think the representatives here, maybe some of the parents, who the users are of this, okay? We have the school itself, gym, and all of that. The community use will be largely youth soccer. I'm sorry, youth basketball.
Wait a minute.
It's the kids that, and now, so we're talking about bleachers because grandparents, all these people come. So the question is, what, by interviewing them, finding out what do they need? And they don't need 3 rows of bleachers and all for that group, but it'd be worth asking for their input, for these people to come, it isn't a huge amount of people who come for these youth games. There's a lot of them, but, so the amount of space needed to accommodate seating may not be, a massive amount of bleachers. So it'd be worth getting input on, for that use, and how much of I'd say it's going to be outside of the immediate school's need for gym. About 80 to 90% of it will be coming from the youth kids, all age groups playing, wanting a space, and how do we accommodate their families? And it's not a massive amount of people. So it could fit into a creative, smaller space.
Sure, could.
So the building use scheduling comes to my department. And I can't tell you the complaints we get about the lack of gym space and the size of our gyms. For us not to look at putting a full-size gym in would be a huge mistake. I mean, I
Which
think
is
we
very
have to go that way
short-sighted.
just to meet
So
the
we're
demands of Westwood, not even counting the other outside Metro West groups that come looking for us
Right.
for space.
Right, and our kids
Everybody's
play
looking
Metro
for it.
West.
So Ken, I think we'll definitely put the full size in. The question is, do you think we also need the cross courts?
I think
middle-
it's
Yes.
worth, I
the
think it's
middle
worth looking
school-
at. The demand is high.
Yes,
So
you're
very-
going to take
Man-
two courts offline essentially because the two schools will
Right, the
combine.
two schools, we are taking 2 courts offline.
So you'll need
Now,
that.
those size courts, Deerfield and Hanlon, neither of them are middle school,
No.
correct?
Which, and part of the issue is that you get a lot of coaches that don't want to practice there.
Yes.
And it looks like a perfect
It's too
gym,
small for the
But
kids.
it's too small for the kids to practice in, which creates
Would
the
a
problem
middle
of use
school
space.
size court be adequate?
Usually, yes, yes.
Like
But-
putting the cross courts in, now you can put actually 4 teams, and they can
Right.
practice in those courts.
So if we did the second option, right, not the whole shebang, but we did the second one, where you could run a high school game with bleachers, or you could run 2 middle school without bleachers.
That would be the way I would recommend.
I think that's huge.
All right, so
That's
use
about
for
a $2
example,
million
just to keep
addition to the
everybody,
project.
at the middle school, they run one practice at that option B, right? It's got 2 little courts going sideways, doesn't really have great baskets, but they only run one practice at a time because it's too small. At the high school, they can split it in half, and they can literally run 2 full practices.
Right.
At 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, they are too big to play at the Deerfield or the Hanlon. I mean,
But can
they're
they play
literally
at the
too
middle
big.
school?
On one court. They can practice on one court, and
Right,
they
so
have
if we
games on
had
one.
2 of those courts, we could get
You really
4
are looking
teams
at option
practice.
C in order to facilitate one more court.
But is this something that we know the community should have input on? Don't you kind of have to design it to see it, and then you can pull back if the community says that's too much?
I think
mean,
that's the
if you
way-
don't design it,
That's the right
then
way.
we don't have options to discuss with the community.
Excuse me. In option B, or the middle option, 8,000 square feet, when you're running the courts parallel, that option does have bleachers, is that correct?
There are bleachers in the space, they just can't be extended while you're using the 2 cross courts.
Do you know what the runoff is? So for example, let me just get up for a second. You're going in this direction for a basket. How close are you, how much depth do you have when you get beyond that basket before you hit the bleachers?
The bleachers are pulled in.
They'll be
I
pulled in.
understand that.
It would-
I'm assuming the bleachers are very close to the end line.
Yeah, usually there's something like 18 inches deep in the.
What do you have here?
So we would provide a minimum of 5 feet of runoff, whether the bleachers are in the closed position or in the open position. So in the closed position, the end line to the bleachers would be at least 5 feet.
Okay, so someone who is on a court, I'm not saying I'm a basketball player, but someone who's on a court, I would recommend that you look at this one, because when you're running in for a layup and you go underneath the basket, you have more runoff before you hit the bleachers.
Yeah.
So that might, from a safety standpoint, that may be something that you want to consider. And you get the 2 courts that you, since you're going to lose a court, so you can have 2 games going on at the same time. I would presume you'd have the clock, the timekeeper and the teams here, and then you could have chairs here for people to sit and watch the games. And then you would have the 2 teams and the clock over here, if that was something that would, if you couldn't use the bleachers. But that
I
would be an
think,
option.
again, I'm going to go back to not holding them to the square footage, but describe, if we are looking for 2 middle school size court plus area for scorekeeper and team, that being able to run 2 games simultaneously, it's a little bit bigger than that. But I think that the information they need is, this is what we want, is we want to be able to run 2 games at the same time for middle school games with a little bit of, with sufficient runoff space. I think it's something of that nature would be the kind of information that would be best to give them. And so if that's what we want, is at a maximum, that's what.
And I think it would be easier to cut back later on than to grow it. So my suggestion is, if that's kind of the thinking, that at least for initial planning, we move forward with, these are all just test fits at this stage.
Right.
But we'd like to make sure that we don't undershoot the test fit.
So you're suggesting we move forward with C?
Well, it sounds like there's some consensus that, at least to keep that on the table, and then eventually you might decide the overall,
Right.
there's
It's
always a
just too
pare back
expensive, or
thing that
it's-
might happen.
Would it help
Can I just
them
say one more thing?
Would it help them if we say we're losing 2 courts? All we want is to get them back. It's not like we're going crazy. Would that help
Help who?
You mean sell it to the
Selling it
community?
to the MSBA, that.
No,
They don't
they're not
pay
going to
us.
reimburse
There's no
any
selling.
of that.
Yeah.
To be clear, the only thing the MSBA will reimburse us for is option one.
Right.
Anything above that, it's not even up for negotiation.
delta.
We don't have to sell them, they're
No,
not buying.
there's nothing to sell.
all
We're not,
local.
we're not getting anywhere on that.
Right.
Can I just follow up on
Pure
one more
community
thing?
benefit.
It comes down to what the community is willing to support.
So what I described, that's just an experience that I had, but I would certainly defer to Ken to find out, as far as the use and things of that nature, what you think would be the most appropriate, as far as how they would be used if you have two games going on at the same
Right,
time.
right, I agree.
But to move this along, if you, it's much easier for them to pare back in the future than it is for them to grow, and grow the footprint.
And go big.
So
And-
then
and
I
go-
would say,
and go big.
it seems to me like everyone's sort of saying, let's move in this direction. If we need to pare it back, we'll pare it back. Because we're going to get the numbers at some point, and you might decide differently.
Okay, my only concern is that if we present this to people and we say, this is a wonderful gym, and you've got 2 cross-court high school gyms, and isn't this look wonderful? And then we say, guess what? We're not gonna give you that. That's my concern. That then we're sort of setting up an expectation in the community and then pulling it back. And when you're building a project, that's not how you wanna sell it. You know, you don't wanna keep taking away things that you've offered up.
But I think if we take things away, it will be a reaction to what people are telling us in terms of cost. I mean, we certainly would like to have everything.
Right.
But if we get the message from the town that, this is just too costly, we're not gonna support it, then we have to start to pare back things.
I think that's a good point, because I agree with your philosophy in terms of building, but a lot of times when you offer something and it gets taken away, it's because things didn't go the way you planned. In this case, we're offering really 2 different things, and we're starting out big, but, you're doing the listening of, okay, we're offering something big because we think that's what the community wants, and Ken will probably have a lot of data to support that. But if the community comes back and says, you know what, we know the demand is there, but it's not worth the money, then that's the reason. It's not like we struggled through the project and that's why it wasn't offered. So I think it's a different case of why something's being taken back.
Can I offer a potential path forward that we can have this discussion with the community in future meetings? Since we have 3 enrollment scenarios here, what if we say the Hanlon-only gym is the 6,000 variety, the Hanlon-Deerfield scenario is the 8,000 square foot variety, and the Hanlon-Sheehan as the largest enrollment is the 10,000 square foot variety. That way we have one of each in each one of the space summaries that we have to present. We'll get an MSBA disposition on all 3, and then we can have a conversation with the community because we've got all 3 represented in each one of the scenarios.
But you could still move them.
And you could still move them
Yeah.
back and forth between them
Yep.
in the next step.
Okay.
It's a good
What
plan.
do you guys think?
I wouldn't attach them to
A school.
each gym to a different proposal.
I think we're
I'd
just
say.
attaching them for MSBA purposes, not for the
Yeah.
community purposes.
And I think as far as the community support, the basketball people in this community would come out in droves, to support option 3. So as far as,
Side?
I think Eddie's in here, you should support a full gym.
But I think the fact that we've talked about this longer than some of the other items
And I knew
indicates
we
the
would.
demand that we've all felt in town for this type of.
Right,
It's a
so
sports town.
it seems like no one is ready to pick an option.
Right.
So I think unless anyone disagrees, we'll design for what Jason said. We're presenting 3 options to the MSBA, or at least that's how we're going. We'll attach a gym to each of the options, but we need to make clear to the community, we're not picking, if you want the 10,000 square feet, don't tell us you want Hanlon Sheehan. We need to make sure they're not linked in the mind of the
Well, so Don was
community.
just raising that point. Maybe then it makes sense to pick the big one for all 3 and see what the community feedback is.
down.
So that
Yeah.
they're not
It's easier.
picking
Right.
an option
Because if
based
we
on the
link
gym
them
size,
to
which is a risk.
Which
They
might
will
happen.
pick it. Well, not they. Some people will make that decision based on the gym.
I think there's support here.
Okay.
In this group, to go for 3, and if we have to pare back, we do it. But to say, that's our ideal, that's what we're doing, try to sell it, and if it doesn't work. But I think there's consensus that we should seriously look at that as our,
Yeah. Well, there's certainly
These are options.
no consensus to take it off the table.
So then what we'll do is we'll size the gymnasium based on these criteria. high school competition, main court, middle school competition, cross court, with the ability to have a couple of rows of the bleachers out while middle school courts are in use. Is that a fair set of principles?
Yes.
So what that would mean is it's probably going to be slightly larger than the 8,000 square foot flavor, but won't be as big as the one on the far right.
In community youth sports.
Yeah.
That's not third group.
That's good.
Okay.
This is what I was hearing, if I could just summarize and just let me know if I'm wrong, right? So one high school court, which is, let's say, this size, right? This size, one high school court, and then two middle school courts, right, going this way, with space for seating. So you could have bleachers here, looking over this whole court, or you could have a small sliver of some seating here, or in the small sliver of seating here.
That's not part of it.
And then enough
that's
runoff to address Chris's concern on the ends. So you could have two middle school games happening. Does that seem to summarize what we heard?
Yes.
For this point.
One of the schools we talked about that we visited, you could actually have an observation deck from the school. Getting the parents up and off of the gym floor, which the referees would really appreciate.
Oh, God. Some of the parents on the young games will get crushed.
One of the schools we looked at, actually, you could have had bleachers right there, and everybody would have been fine and happy and warm, and the kids would have been having a great time.
Okay. All right, I think we've got a decision. Oh,
Not to belabor, but it's December, basketball season. So if any of these maps look kind of foreign, you can probably pop in a game. If you see any games at any of the, if you see cars at an elementary school on a Saturday, it's because there's a basketball game. You can walk into any elementary schools and you can see how tight it is. Parents love that because they're about to whack with a basketball with the young kids. And then in the high school, you can always see it. There's a reason there's padding on the wall. Because kids slam into that.
Right.
I own one of those kids that have made good use of that, that padding. So, I mean, if this just doesn't make sense to you, just pop your head in for a couple minutes, and it does really help to walk in and go, okay, now I see what the chairs are, what people are kind of talking about, because we'll be making decisions on this. And if it is hard if you have never actually seen it in action. So I just throw
great.
that out.
Thank you. Very good point. Everyone go to a basketball game. All right, I'm going to move us along, conscious of time. I want us out of here by 9:30. So we're now moving on to evaluation criteria. So just to set this up a little bit for Tim, we are going to, the next phase, we're going to be looking at basically these options, but different variations of them. And the design team and Tim's team and Compass will present these to us. And we need to evaluate them. We need to have some sort of criteria to evaluate them. So Compass has come up with an initial pass at sort of what is that criteria going to be? And I'm going to turn it over to him to talk to us about that.
So I'm going to go real quick. So the idea is with the criteria is to create objectivity and transparency. So people see that this is not something that is done by, it's done with at least as much as we can with some objectivity. That's the goal with criteria. And so we're going to assess the options against these criteria, which you guys need to decide. At some point, not today, but at some point, you need to decide the criteria. So we'll do it twice. We're going to do it at some level when we go from a long list to a short list, and then, which is March, and then in June, we'll do it for the short list to the final selection. So the draft, these are the scenarios, but if you look at this is kind of where an option might draft, but if you could go to the list of criteria. These are sort of what you saw in the Doran Whittier presentation around the kinds of things that you're looking at. So we've looked at criteria that sort of measure those issues. This group, it was actually a group of us sort of kind of came to this as a consensus and as like an initial draft. And as you can see, these are fairly summary, so there's a lot of factors that might go into any individual criteria. That's part of the conversation we need to have with you folks. But this is sort of and this is, by the way, not this is pretty typical, and there's not a lot here that's particularly Westwood specific, but these are the sort of criteria that we typically see measuring against, the options being measured against. And there's a lot of different ways to measure them. You can measure them very granularly by like sort of a number system, or you can do it a little more, color-based or something that is more, not quite as specific as numbers. So I think our goal is to try to get a small little subgroup, which I can leave with you, Mayor, to sort of work with us, to kind of a working group, to kind of work this whole issue on criteria and come back to you with a sort of a more formal proposal around what we would expect to do with that.
Yeah, and just, these are very, as Tim mentioned, very high-level categories of what we expect to score each option that we're presented on. And in order to really make a decision on how to move forward with criteria, I think it's probably easier with a subcommittee. Otherwise, we're going to have to get this group together every time, and it gets a little unwieldy. And just thinking about who should be on that subcommittee, I was thinking that, I would be on it, and then from the district, Emily would be on it. Tony from school committee as chair would be on it. Nancy from select board would be on it. And then John from the PBC would be on it. And Ken as the facility guru, for lack of a better word, would be on it. So that's 6 people, which I think is a manageable number. However, I'd like to open that up to discussion to see if anyone has other recommendations. If any of the people I've proposed, who I haven't told about, don't want to be on it.
Can I just clarify? So I'm happy to be on it, but my clarification, so this is a subcommittee to sort of flesh out the evaluation criteria, but then,
so that's the first job.
That's the
is
first job, okay.
To flush out what the criteria will be of the evaluation, and also how are we going to score it? Are we going to get very granular? Are we going to say rate it from 1 to 10? Or are we going to say, red, orange, green? And that's the job of the subcommittee, to come up with the form that we'll use. The second job of the subcommittee will then, once we've, presented to the SBC for review and approval, once we've come up with that criteria, we've come up with the form, the second job for the subcommittee will be to take a first pass at evaluating each of the options. Again, easier to do in a smaller group than a big group, and then the subcommittee will present its recommendation for, each criteria, each option. And you can see, the bigger group will see how this subcommittee has scored each option, what it looks like, and we can have a discussion that way. It's just a more streamlined process to evaluate all of these options.
I think it also would be valuable if other towns have done this before,
Yeah, so Tim is actually has started with what he used in Wellesley. And Doran Whittier has provided things of what they've used in other towns as well.
That'd be valuable to see.
Yeah.
And may I?
Yes.
Nancy, I would add that we use that kind of criteria process in doing the public safety buildings.
Yep, so great.
So we have internal, and Tim can help provide that, but it was extremely helpful.
Yes. So does anyone have any issues with the formation of a subcommittee to begin with? No. And anyone want to speak to the members on it, whether you agree, anyone else wants to be on it, feel they should be on it? Nope. Okay. So I need a motion to appoint, do I need to go through all 6 members? Okay. I need a motion to appoint Maya Plotkin, Emily Parks, Tony Mullen, Nancy Hyde, John Cummings, and Ken Aries to the Evaluation Criteria Subcommittee of the School Building Committee.
I make that motion.
I have a second?
Second.
All in favor? Oh, yes, I know, yep, I need to do a verbal. Before I do that, any further discussion? No, okay, so we need to do a verbal call. Ken?
Yes.
Allison? Yes. Chris?
Yes.
Sarah?
yes.
John?
Yes.
Charlie?
Yes.
Pam?
Yes.
Abby?
Yes.
Nancy? Lemma is not here. Josepha?
Yes.
Carol's not here. Michelle?
Yes.
Tony's not here. And Emily?
Yes.
And I vote yes as well. Motion is unanimous. Okay, the second item in our action items is approval of the November 8th, 2019 minutes. Does anyone have any comments to the minutes? Can I get a motion for approval?
So moved.
Can I get a second?
Second.
Okay. Ken, do you approve of the minutes?
Yes.
Allison?
Yes.
Chris?
Yes.
Sarah?
Yes.
John?
Yes.
Charlie?
Yes.
Pam?
I'm going to abstain, I was not at the meeting.
Okay. Abby?
Yes.
Nancy?
Yes.
Lemma is not here. Josepha?
Yeah.
Carol's not here. Michelle?
Yes.
Tony is not here. Emily?
Yes.
And I approve as well. Motion is unanimous. Final approval. And we actually, I should just set this up. So it has been recommended to the school building committee to hire a redistricting consultant. As you know, 2 of the 3 scenarios we're studying involve consolidation, which will involve redistricting. Sheehan and Hanlon is probably a more robust redistricting. And we believe that hiring a consultant would really help us with that. The funds would be paid from the feasibility budget, and we do have room in the budget to pay for this. So what we are asking for now, or what we're discussing now, is whether we should move forward with the redistricting consultant. We would look for a contract not to exceed $16,500. And we feel that that would be able to give us a good analysis of the redistricting. So I'm opening the floor for discussion on this.
Good luck.
What's that?
I wish them luck.
Yes, Nancy?
My question would be, are there people out there that specialize in this, or they have a broader capability and this is part of what the work that they're capable of doing? What kind of professional consultant is out there to do this?
So I'm going to let Tim
Yeah,
speak to that.
so these people, they do other parts similar, sort of demographic type projections, but there are people that do this work. Wellesley's doing this work. Other town, I think Lincoln or some town up there did as well. So this group that we've gotten an initial proposal from does this work as one of its main lines of business, but they do other things, Nancy. They have other demographic type work they do. I'm not sure what it is, but.
But we still have to put it out to bid, right?
Well, we're going to work with Michelle because we think it's within the limits that the town can run this contract themselves, and Michelle, if you want to
Yeah,
press that.
Nancy, Tim and Chin and I talked yesterday, and we will be able to go direct. It's consultant work, so that's fine, and it's a low dollar threshold. So we decide the quickest route is for the town to take this and go direct.
Great, thanks.
Any other discussion? Nope. Can I get a motion to approve hiring a redistricting consultant for an amount of contract not to exceed $16,500?
So moved.
Okay. Ken? Chris? Oh, yeah, Chris.
Yes.
Allison?
Yes.
Sarah?
Yes.
John?
Yes.
Charlie?
Yes.
Pam?
Yes.
Abby?
Yes.
Nancy?
Yes.
Lemma's not here. Josepha?
Yes.
Carol's not here. Michelle?
Yes.
Tony's not here. Emily?
Yes.
And I approve as well. Motion is unanimous. And the last item under action items is to approve the invoices for the period ending November 30th, 2019. I had it on my phone, but can I just use this? Specifically, we have an invoice from Compass for $18,670. We have an invoice from Doran Whittier for $85,000, and we have an invoice from Westwood Media Center for $500. The total amount is $104,170. Is there any discussion on these invoices? The first 2 are all contractual. Okay. Can I get a motion to approve these invoices as specified for a total of $104,170?
Make that motion.
I get a second?
Second.
All in favor? Oh, nope, wait, just kidding.
Yes.
Allison.
Yes.
Chris.
Yes.
Sarah.
Yes.
John.
Yes.
Charlie.
Yes.
Pam.
Yes.
Abby.
Yes.
Nancy.
Yes.
Lemma's not here. Josepha.
Yes.
Carol's not here. Michelle.
Yes.
Tony's not here. Emily.
Yes.
And I approve. Motion is unanimous. Finally, new business. The only thing I want to say is that the next few meetings of the school building committee are going to be critical. We have, as you saw today, we have decisions that we need to make. So I just wanted to let everyone be aware of that, and try to make it if you can. We have expanded the meetings to an hour and a half to be able to accommodate these kind of discussions. I think the 8 a.m. is still working. You know, definitely let me know if you're having issues with that, but other than that, we appreciate your time and your
could I-
commitment.
I'll get it in before the time limit's up. We had the MSBA kickoff this week.
Oh, yeah.
Just to quickly, that went very well. There was no surprises to that. It's pretty much a process type meeting, but we met our team, and I think that's going to work out very well. And we've scheduled the sustainability kind of organizing meeting. I wouldn't call it a kickoff, but it's just about how we're going to look at sustainability, and Tom Philbin's here, so that's scheduled for early in January. So we'll probably have a report on that at least at the next building
In the
committee.
January meeting.
Yep.
Great.
And I just want to say, just for informational purposes, that we have submitted the first round of bills to MSBA and received our share of their reimbursement. So the process is in
Excellent.
place
It's
and working
working.
well. Yes.
Don.
And then, lastly, the next building committee meeting, we'll talk about their importance. We will be coming in here with design options. So it'll be a fun
Get
meeting.
ready.
Yay.
We'll get them out early, enough time for them to see.
Yeah.
Just so everybody knows, Geotech over the Christmas break will be doing core samplings of the school properties.
Yes.
On the 23rd, I think, Monday and Friday of next week.
That's very important for the public to know. We'll be tweeting about that, so no one should mistakenly think that construction
We've
has somehow
broken ground.
started. That isn't what's happening. Site evaluation.
Any other new business? Nope. Okay, can I get a motion to adjourn? Second?
Second.
Ken?
Yes.
Allison? Chris?
Yes.
Sarah? John?
Yes.
Charlie? Pam?
Yes.
Abby? Yep. Nancy? Lemma's not here. Josepha? Carol's not here. Michelle? Tony's not here. Emily?
Yes.
And I vote yes as well. We are adjourned. Thank you, everyone. Happy holidays.
Happy
Everyone have a
holidays. Happy New Year.
Great, great.